The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. All this month, we're talking about political theater, and today my guest is Susanne Shawyer. She teaches theater history at Elon University in North Carolina, where she's the coordinator of the Drama and Theater Studies program. Susanne, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
You set this really interesting scene in a recent paper that you've written about the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. I wonder if you could paint that picture for our listeners. What happened at this convention? What was the scene like on the streets of Chicago?
What I'm particularly interested in is what the activists at the time later called the Battle of Michigan Avenue. And that refers to some street action and police, army, and National Guard response to demonstrations that happened on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, right in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel. And it was 1968, it was August, it was the hot summer in the city, and thousands of activists had descended on Chicago to try to participate in and talk to delegates for the Democratic National Convention. 1968 was an election year in the United States. At the convention, they were deciding who would be the Democratic nominee for president, and thousands of activists, peace activists, anti-war activists, Black Panther, Black national activists, students for Democratic Society, the New Left, all kinds of hippies and Yippies, and a whole variety of different kinds of activists came to Chicago. And the mayor of Chicago was a little nervous about all the activists coming. There had previously been quite a lot of urban violence leading up to the Democratic Convention, violence after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April, violence in especially urban centers with demonstrators frustrated with the lack of movement in civil rights in the United States. Suspicion of the hippies. Who were these people? Why did they look differently? Why were they taking over public places and arguing that we needed to change the entire culture? So the mayor of Chicago was a little nervous, and he invited in not just the National Guard, but also the regular Army troops. And he spread word through the media that the troops had orders to, quote, shoot to kill demonstrators who were looting or instigating violence. And the demonstrators in return thought this was over the top, a militarization of police in Chicago. And so we had a real possibility for conflagration in the streets of Chicago, which happened in late August 1968 when demonstrators were trying to get to delegates who were staying at the Conrad Hilton Hotel on Michigan Avenue. And they ran into press corps outside the hotel. The nervous police and National Guard came in with riot police and tanks and tear gas. And a lot of people ended up getting injured in the violence, including reporters, journalists, passersby, peace activists, more radical demonstrators. And all of this was being taped by television cameras and then sent over the airwaves to ordinary Americans watching at home.
You mentioned all these different groups that are out on the street from a whole spectrum of political backgrounds, political beliefs. One group in particular that you mentioned, the Yippies. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about them.
So I find the Yippies particularly interesting as a theater historian because the Yippies were interested in theater, and they were interested in using theater theory in their demonstrations. The Yippies in general were a mix of the hippie movement and a more radical, do your own thing, almost libertarian kind of attack on the establishment. They wanted a complete cultural revolution in the United States. They wanted to overthrow capitalism and overthrow militarism, and they imagined in its place would be a free-for-all, do-your-own-thing experience of what they imagined as a kind of complete freedom. If you wanted to do drugs, that would be okay. If you wanted free love, that was okay. If you wanted to throw rocks at government buildings, that was okay too in the Yippie philosophy. And the Yippies were a very sort of loose network of radicals, but a couple of their leaders came to prominence through the press and through book deals. And you might have heard of Jerry Rubin or Abby Hoffman as the key Yippie leaders. And these young men were also interested in theater. They didn't think of themselves as theater makers or theater practitioners, as actors or performers necessarily, but they did read theater and they also read communications theory. And they were interested in sort of taking ideas from theater and using them to make their demonstrations more effective, to make their demonstrations more appealing to the press, to make them surprising, to make them colorful, to make them interesting so they would get all the media attention they wanted, to then sort of widen awareness of who the Yippies were and why they wanted to overthrow the government and the entire culture of the United States.
It's interesting that you describe what they do in that way because I think some of their more famous performances, I guess you could call them, have been perhaps misunderstood in the way that people remember the 60s. There is, for instance, the incident where they tried to levitate the Pentagon.
Yes, that's one of my favorite ones. This was part of a giant peace march in October 1967 that started in the mall in Washington, and all the demonstrators planned to march over to the Pentagon and essentially occupy the Pentagon parking lot. And the Abby Hoffman, is one of the leaders of the Yippies, wanted to really get press attention. He didn't want it to be just another demonstration. And so he told the press they were going to levitate the Pentagon. They were going to try to exorcise the evil spirits from the Pentagon using witchcraft of some kind. Of course, they didn't specify what kind of witchcraft. And they announced this to the media ahead of time. So, of course, all the reporters and journalists at the Pentagon were very interested what's going to happen with this levitation. And it essentially was a number of the Yippies dressed up in kind of fantastical witchy costumes with feathers and beads and incense, and they chanted a little and played music. And obviously, the Pentagon did not levitate, but they got the attention of the media and then were interviewed by the media and got to talk about what is a Yippie and let's overthrow the culture and have a complete revolution. So it was quite an effective performance demonstration.
Now, I wonder what exactly in Chicago the Yippies would have considered to be the performance that they were staging. You write that they had a very specific purpose in mind, but what we have just heard about in the streets of Chicago in 1968 might not normally be what we think of when we think of theater, when we think of performance. So, what were they trying to do? What were they staging in the streets of Chicago?
Well, the Yippies were very interested in this concept called theater of cruelty. And theater of cruelty comes to us from a French theater a director, a theorist, a playwright called Antonin Artaud. And Artaud wrote of theater of cruelty as a new way of thinking about performance. He was frustrated with the bourgeois theater of his time, the way he felt people attended theater and they didn't really feel anything and it didn't really change them in any way. And it was sort of what you did because you were middle class. And Artaud really wanted a theater that enervated people, that engaged them emotionally and psychologically and viscerally. And so, in his book, The Theater and Its Double, which was translated and published in the United States in 1958, he had all these ideas of how do you make theater psychologically and emotionally engaging. And he talked about this idea of cruelty as a kind of emotional or psychological cruelty, like get people to really confront what their culture is doing and how the theater of the time is sort of sucking away people's souls and it's stultifying. Like let's get people really engaged in the deeper emotional issues happening in culture. So the Yippies saw that idea of theater of cruelty and they thought, oh, maybe we can use this in our demonstrations. There's been so many demonstrations in the street in the 1960s, especially in the past year, from the long hot summer of 1967 with a lot of urban violence, racially tinged in cities across the United States, with all the peace marches, with demonstrations in response to the assassination of Dr. King and Senator Robert Kennedy. And so the Yippies were really thinking of, how do we make this a demonstration that people now pay attention to, right? How do we make it a demonstration that ordinary kind of middle class Americans in suburbia don't tune out of, that a demonstration that doesn't make them turn off their television, but makes them stop and think and question what is happening in the world today? What is wrong with America? How can it be fixed? How does it relate to me? And that's the sort of psychological cruelty Artaud talks about, and that's what the Yippies wanted to harness. So they approached Chicago with a sense of, how can we really make people sit up and notice and think about this demonstration? And one of the things they were interested in was the militarism of the police response in Chicago, the use of the National Guard, the use of the army troops. And they suspected, and they kind of knew, that if they went there and tried to start a riot would start. And of course, later on, they were indicted for trying to start a riot. But they thought what they could do is really show ordinary Americans images of their National Guard, their US Army, firing tear gas on ordinary citizens, tanks rolling down a street in downtown Chicago, ordinary citizens demonstrating, marching, and getting attacked by the police. And the Yippies wanted these images right in front of the television cameras so that people at home would respond in some way. So it's not theater in the traditional sense. We think about theater, it's not happening in a theater building. We don't particularly have characters involved or a narrative structure, but what we have activists thinking about theater theory and trying to use theater theory in their political demonstrations. And that's what interests me as a theater historian.
And one of the really interesting things that I think you do is you don't just talk about Chicago in 1968 and what the Yippies tried to do there. You talk about how people responded and how that response fell short of what they were aiming for, how it maybe met some of their expectations. I wonder if you could talk about that process a little bit.
Well, the question of how do audiences respond to activist theater is a question we're always asking. If you create a performance that you want some change as to result from it, if you want audiences to go away and change how they engage in the world, to think differently, but also to act differently, how do you track that? How do you record that? How do you find evidence that your activist performance really is causing a change in action? And there's lots of ways you can do it, right? So you can do qualitative methods and chat to people. You can do more quantitative methods and do surveys and look at demographics. But it's harder for a theater historian. How do you find out how audiences responded and did any change happen? And this was a question that was really troubling me as I was looking at the Yippies using theater theory in 1968. So, how did these audiences in 1968 respond? And I came across an archive of folders in the President Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Archive. And in this folder, I found telegrams and letters that Americans had written or sent immediately in the aftermath of the Battle of Michigan Avenue, that they had seen these scenes of violence on their television screens, and just as the Yippies had hoped for, they had responded in some way, and they responded by writing letters to the president. So there's several folders full of about 600 telegrams and handwritten letters and typed up letters of people who had watched on television and had watched the news or heard it on the radio, and then had immediately felt the need to write to President Johnson and tell him how this performance affected them. So it's a treasure trove, a real treasure trove for the theater historian.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So there's all kinds of interesting responses in these telegrams and letters. you can tell that people are really emotionally affected by what they see on television, by these scenes of tear gas, by the scenes of especially the reporters, the press presence getting caught up in the violence and getting also attacked by the police. People are using words like shocking or obscene to talk about the violence. They say that they are outraged. They say they are shocked. They say they are scandalized. They use words that have a lot of emotional resonance to sort of say, hey, Mr. President, there's something going on. You need to know what this is. They talk about how it seems un American. Right? I can't believe that this is happening in Chicago. I can't believe this is happening in America. They quote lines from America the Beautiful and from the Constitution to sort of use as evidence to show Johnson that what is happening in the streets of Chicago right now doesn't quite seem like it ought to be happening in the United States. So those responses I find are really interesting for the emotional and effective power of the audience response. They're really quite interesting and emotional to read.
You talk about this kind of heady theoretical concept, and maybe we can discuss it briefly here. This idea of something called dissensus. This, for lack of a better way of saying it, demonstrating a gap between rhetoric and reality. I wonder if you could just very briefly walk us through that.
So, dissensus is an idea that comes from French political philosopher Jacques Rancière. And he really sees dissensus as central to the democratic process. Dissensus is when you notice that gap between political rhetoric and then the lived reality you are experiencing. So you might recognize that you're told everyone has freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and then you notice that wait a second, there are demonstrators here on the street whose freedom of speech and assembly is not being recognized by state actors, by forces of law and order. And in that moment of disjuncture, in that moment of confusion, that's a dissensus there. And you, as a democratic actor, as a participant in the democratic process, can then have that moment of dissensus and then think about, okay, well, that needs to change. And what happens now? And how do I help other people recognize this gap between the political reality and the rhetoric I've been told of what the political world ought to be?
One of the things that I really like too is that you do a good job of analyzing these letters to LBJ and pointing out that in some ways the response of writing to the president and asking him to right these wrongs isn't exactly the sort of dissensus that Abby Hoffman, the Yippies, were looking for when they staged this demonstration, this performance.
Exactly. The Yippies were looking for a reaction of people recognizing dissensus. Hey, there's a problem here. They're firing tear gas and they're rolling tanks down Michigan Avenue on ordinary citizens, including the press. And they want the audience then to essentially overthrow the government, establish a counterculture, reject capitalism and militarism, and embrace a sort of free for all libertarian. Utopia they've imagined. But that's not happening. People are writing to the president because he's the president and he represents this hierarchical buck stops here, commander in chief authority. And they appeal to him. They appeal to him as Mr. President. They appeal to him as Sir. They appeal to him as commander in chief. And they say things use your authority to stop what's happening in Chicago. Somebody writes, Mayor Daley has gone berserk, so please send help, right? Thinking that the president can do something about this. Somebody writes, the National Guard is causing problems, so please send in the army, right? So an appeal to a higher order, a higher authority, looking to LBJ as a general who could marshal his troops in some way, and looking for that ultimate authority to change things. And so it's not quite the dissensus that the Yippies wanted, because these Americans who are responding are very much still the Yippies would say trapped in this idea of we have a hierarchy, we have a political system, we need to look to the democratically elected leader of that system to make change. Whereas the Yippies were hoping, no, just throw it all out, and change starts from the grassroots, ground up, rather from the top down authority. So it's really interesting to see many of these highly emotional pleas to LBJ to do something about the Battle of Michigan Avenue, and yet the writers can't really conceive of any other way to stop what has happened or to change what has happened. They still only imagine this very hierarchical military structure as the answer to what has happened on the streets of Chicago.
And I think one of the more sobering things that you point out here is the potential limits of using performance, of using theater as a vehicle for protest, as a vehicle for social and political change. You're certainly not negative by any means, but I think you do a very good job of pointing out the limits.
Yeah, I think in this case in particular, where I have all this evidence from the audience and their response, I found it very interesting because I was, partly with my own utopic vision, I was hoping to find, people saying, now I agree with the Yippies and I'm, throwing over the order and I'm going to march on the streets myself. But nobody's saying that, right? They want the violence to end, but they don't want to join in. They don't imagine that they, as individuals, have much ability or power to make a change, which is what the Yippies were trying to do with their performance. The Yippies' performance was limited in a number of ways. There were other performers, in a sense, other activists were there. They didn't quite control what the police and the National Guard were doing. They wanted to use the media, but they themselves were not members of the media, so they got used in perhaps ways they didn't quite expect. Everything, of course, is happening in a mediated fashion, so the audience is watching through television rather than being there themselves as participants. And I think the Yippies just really perhaps underestimated the power of um, the safety and security of the establishment. I found this giant folder of responses from highly emotional people. And then I looked up what they call the White House mail summary. And every week, the White House recorded how many letters came in, how many telegrams, what were people writing to the president about. And I thought, oh, it's August, it's 1968, it's the Democratic National Convention, there's rioting on the streets, everyone's writing in. It's going to be a fantastic week of a whole lot of responses. But when I compared the mail summary for this last week of August 1968 with other typical weeks in 1968 and in 1967, there was no uptick in correspondence to the White House at all. It was a low flow week of mail, very typical for the summer months. Not much difference from the week before. So even though this small archive of highly emotional responses seems like this performance had a big effect, um, it was really a drop in the bucket. People would just not a whole lot of people actually wrote to the president about this. Many more were writing in other weeks about more political things, who should be the Democratic candidate for president, and the people who wrote in were highly affected, but it didn't really cause any kind of widespread emotional response to the Yippies' performance.
So we've been talking about 1968, about history, but unfortunately, I think for many listeners, images of armored vehicles in the streets, of clouds of tear gas, that sounds like it could come from the nightly news. Uh, I wonder if you are willing to kind of go out on a limb and suggest anything that we might be able to draw from your research here that would apply to the role that political activism and theater has to play now.
Well, as a theater historian and a theater maker, I always say theater, of course, has a role to play now. Absolutely. And I think theater does have a role to play in terms of demonstrations, political activism, um, whether it's on the street, whether it's in a traditional theater building, um, because even thinking about politics or activism through a theatrical lens. What is the story being told? Who are the characters? Whose story do I want to highlight? What is the emotional journey I want my audience to go on? All of those are very useful questions for anyone trying to make a political point or participate in the political system. I think one of the things the Yippies tell us is they didn't quite go far enough, if you will. And I'm not talking about the violence. I'm talking about thinking, well, we'll set up a situation and then people will get it, right? Then they never actually help their audience find the solution to this great emotional response that they were trying to generate. So once you feel these emotions, then what do you do with them? And the Yippies didn't really help the audience walk through that. You could work at a grassroots level, right? You could start to question all these other things. You could participate in your local hippie group, or join the Students for a Democratic Society, or join the Black Panthers. I mean, there's other organizations you could maybe participate in. Because the Yippies were anti-organization, they didn't really have an answer for people looking for active ways to make a change or participate. So I guess what the Yippies teach me today is help your audience find those solutions. Don't just point out and hope they reach that moment of dissensus where they see the gap between the reality and the rhetoric, but help them then move beyond that. And I think that's useful advice for any activist theater or theatrical activist.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Susanne. This is really fascinating, and thank you so much for talking about it and explaining it to us.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.